give a big virtual welcome to the aforementioned Dr. Marnie Stanley, Dean of the Arts and Humanities at VIU, as she will be introducing today's featured speaker, Professor Terri Doughty from the Department of English. Dr. Stanley.
Thank you, Tim. That happens to be my favorite Christmas carol. In honor of Terry's subject, I wore my pants with plants. So I just want to say, Terry and I have worked together for 25 years, and Terry's work, which is often in children's lit or Victorian literature, and children's lit both historic and contemporary, often deals with boundaries and the contact zone created by one country bordering another, one species bordering another, one time frame bordering another. And that notion of boundaries and the permeability of boundaries has been a theme through much of her work, even when working in different genres and different historic periods. Terry is a very productive scholar and is hosting a conference this spring looking at children's literature and the environment. So stay tuned if you're interested in that. It's likely to be a virtual platform as well. And plant species, of course, which are around 400,000 in our world, but we identify, not we personally, but botanists identify another 2,000 or so per year, represent nature at her most spectacularly creative. And when we think about key processes of plants like photosynthesis and how they control the Earth's atmosphere, as well as providing us with so much food, our new apple tree at home, our first apple tree, produced its first real crop of apples this year, and we're just marveling at them every evening as we have our post-dinner apple and think about what makes an apple and how the tree converts our rather miserable rocky soil into this gorgeous fruit. So plants are a species we interact with a great deal, we depend on a great deal, but we don't necessarily think about all that much. This morning, I just happened to be listening to Gardener's Question Time on the BBC, and they were talking about the Darth Vader flower, which I urge you to look up. It does look extraordinarily like Darth Vader. And it holds little flies captive overnight, just overnight. It's not cruel like its namesake. And during that process, it has a little sex change and then reverts. And like what this one little plant, a member of the begonia family, is capable of doing in short processes of time, we really haven't stretched our minds to think about the plant world and its creativity. And Terry wants to bring us today the understanding of a historic woman writer working with children who did take time to think about plants. Please welcome Terri Doughty.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Marnie. I'm just going to share my screen now, Marnie, and I want to thank the Arts and Humanities Colloquium Committee, and I want to thank all of the people here who are working on the technology to make this happen. These are indeed very strange times, and so this is a new experience for all of us, and I'm very grateful that you've made it possible for me to share my work with everyone. I also thank Ravi Moabir for my title slide, which he designed. And I also would like to acknowledge a ViewRack grant that and support from the past Dean of Arts and Humanities, Ross McKay, which allowed me to go to Sweden for a month in 2018 and do some research at the Swedish Institute for Children's Books. And I know we have had an acknowledgement of being on Snuneymuxw land. I live, work, learn, love, have raised my family on Snuneymuxw land, for which I'm grateful. And it seems very timely for me to make that acknowledgement as well today, because of course, non-Indigenous people have a great deal to learn from Indigenous people about living with plants. Finally, I just need to acknowledge that parts of this talk are covered in a book chapter that is currently in the publication process. It is on plants and children's literature. So today I'm going to talk about, I didn't acknowledge how dark it was going to be here. Okay. So can it's not letting me change my slides in the shared screen when I'm screen sharing. Why is this? Somebody want to share that information with me?
Yeah, Terri, in class that happens sometimes, and just press, like you have to get out of, you have to put your cursor back onto the screen and then click your PowerPoint, and then it will let you forward.
Click my PowerPoint.
Yeah, because you might have gone back.
Thank you, Cynthia. Yay, tech support online. I love it. Okay, so I just wanted to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start by talking about plant blindness in children. I'm going to talk a bit about the difference between anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism, the kind of brief theoretical framework for thinking about human entanglements with other species. And then I'm going to talk about Elsa Beskow, focusing very briefly on her biography and her artistic influences, and then looking at several of her books. All right, so first though, before I get launched into all of that, people always ask me, why are you doing this research on this early 20th century Swedish woman writer? And I think it's a nice story about how the process of research is actually not really always a calculated thing. In fact, it's often quite serendipitous. I had been invited to the University of Stockholm in February of 2017, and I had a very short week there. On my way leaving Stockholm in the airport in the duty-free shop, I kind of just walked by a display of all of this china, and it intrigued me because I thought it was by a British illustrator named Cicely Mary Barker, and I thought, why are they selling this in the Stockholm airport? So I looked at it more closely and realized that this actually is not by Cicely, these were not by Cicely Mary Barker, that they, and here you can see a difference between the two artists, with Barker, the more kind of naturalistic depiction of the dog, Violet Fairy. Sorry, I can't see my slides well because I've got this little box of people's heads in the middle. Oh, there we go. The dog Violet Fairy. So I found out that there was this Swedish artist named Elsa Beskow, and I know her work has been translated into English since the 1930s. I know that they continue to be very popular with Waldorf schools, Montessori schools. However, I never encountered her work when I was a child, and I haven't really encountered it, or hadn't really encountered it, in my research in children's literature, because most of the work on her is done in Swedish. So at first, I thought I'd like to learn more about the connections between these two authors. This is part of an early 20th century fascination with flower fairies, flower people, whatever you call them. But I kept looking and found that Beskow is very much affiliated with or seen as creating a Swedish national identity rooted in human closeness to nature. And that kind of got me thinking more about the nature angle. And I also started to notice that her work tends by and large to be more relational than the other works. And what I mean by that is that her work tends to present not only plants in very vividly imagined communities, but more interactions between humans and plant people. And people are now calling the Anthropocene. And it seems to me that it is worth thinking about why it matters that we might learn to look at plants differently and think about them differently, particularly our relationship to them. In Western culture, informed by a Judeo-Christian tradition, humans have followed a belief that other species of the planet exist to serve human needs. I know it's not a universal belief. I know that other cultures, such as indigenous cultures, think differently about human relations with other species. However, through ongoing impacts of colonization, the belief that human needs trump all others has had an outsized influence in our world. What I find so intriguing in Beskow's work is her subtle shifting of relationships in her books. Capable children do harvest food and materials to sustain life from the land, but there is an element of being with nature, not viewing the natural world as simply a collection of resources. I especially have become interested in her treatment of plant-human interactions because plants are so often presented merely as backdrop in many children's books. This is no doubt related to what has come to be known as plant blindness, which Margareta Hagström defines in part as incapacity to see or observe plants in our environment and failure to understand plants' function on Earth. As Mung Balding and Catherine Williams have noted, most conservation initiatives have been biased towards animals and birds, which they attribute in part to plant blindness. In one response to plant blindness over the past decade, the field of critical plant studies has emerged. This interdisciplinary field, combining ways of knowing from biology, botany, philosophy, cultural studies, and the arts, fits with the broader categories of eco-criticism and eco-pedagogy. Lydia Kokkola points to the need for a, quote, radical reconsideration of human nature politics, end quote, arguing that critical plant studies promotes, quote, understanding that plants, not people, hold the balance of power over the future of the earth, end quote. In relation to children's views of plants, qualitative studies have examined whether they have the capacity to recognize plants as living beings deserving of moral and ethical consideration. They do. Eco-pedagogic programs and new materialist research projects have taken children out of classrooms into the natural world to process their own encounters with plants. Literary criticism of the kind I am practicing with Beskow's work considers the degree to which a literary text might impact children's awareness of plant others and affect their sense of relationship with plants. At this point, I think it would be useful to segue to talk a bit about anthropomorphism. The books I'm dealing with present plants as people and give plants humanoid avatars. It is very easy to argue that such anthropomorphism is just another form of anthropocentrism, demonstrating how incapable we humans are of engaging with otherness and how we privilege human experience over any other kind. To be fair, though, plants really are other. We cannot walk in their roots, so to speak, or hear their communications. How then to cross that plant-human barrier to achieve any kind of understanding or respect? We need to think of anthropomorphism as a form of analogic thinking that does not necessarily have to carry a pro-human bias. Some researchers have suggested that anthropomorphism may be a necessary element in humans' capacity to form attachments with nature. Regarding children and anthropomorphism, Megan Geertz argues that anthropocentrism is a product of early experiences and social learning, and not necessarily just of anthropomorphism. I do not see Beskow's use of anthropomorphism as anthropocentric. Rather, her plant people invite readers to consider the ways in which plants might be intelligent beings with agency. The idea that plants might be intelligent is still a challenging one for most humans, though there now is a growing body of scientific evidence that plants are sentient and reactive, that they communicate with one another and other species, and that they form networks. Marnie mentioned the piece that she heard on the radio earlier. Another good resource is a good starting point is the book Brilliant Green by Stefano Mancuso and Alessandra Viola. if we start to see plants not as non-human, meaning less than human, but rather as non-human and equally precious, we can begin to think differently about how to live with plants. Scholars working in tangential fields have come up with different tropes for thinking about human-nature interactions. The Common Worlds Collective is a group of people working in environmental childhood studies, ecopedagogy, and early childhood education who use the idea of common worlds to convey the need for we humans to be guided by knowledge that all life forms on Earth live in an interconnected or common world. One of the best known theorists working on nature cultures and human/more than human interactions is Donna Haraway. Her recent book, Staying with the Trouble, makes use of various tropes of entanglement, such as string creations with interconnected threads and knots, spider webs, and tentacles going everywhere. She argues that all earthlings are kin in the deepest sense, and it is past time to practice care of kinds as assemblages, not species, one at a time. Our lives are entangled with the lives of other beings on the planet, and we need not only a cognitive shift, but an emotional shift to understand this on a visceral level, so that our actions are planned and performed with impacts on all species in mind. Such a shift in understanding requires us to be able to feel kinship with other life forms. Some studies have demonstrated that children's picture books, particularly the illustrations, can have a powerful impact on children's sense of being a part of the natural world. Beskow's illustrations, I would argue, also invite child readers to see themselves as akin to and having relationships with plants, which are presented as equally deserving of moral consideration as humans. So I'll turn now and focus on Elsa Beskow. It's a picture from 1901, around the time of her breakthrough publication, so-called, of Peter in Blueberry Land. Elsa Martman was born in Stockholm in 1874. Her father died when she was 15, and her mother moved with her 6 children into the home of her unmarried siblings. One of Beskow's aunts, Amalia Falstad, ran a school and was very influenced by the ideas of reform pedagogy. As an adult, Beskow maintained a friendship with her aunt's friend, Ellen Key, a Swedish feminist and promoter of child-centered education. We can see the influence of reform pedagogy in Beskow's depictions of creative and capable children. When parents or adult caregivers are present, they support rather than direct or control the children's activities. Beskow enjoyed drawing as a child and studied art at the Tekniska skolan from 1890 to 1895. Her first public illustrations appeared in 1894 in the magazine Jultomten, which is a Christmas annual. I guess the title would translate something like Father Christmas. And she worked as a drawing teacher until she married in 1897. Her husband was initially a fellow artist, Nathaniel Beskow, who changed vocation and became a minister. Eventually, the family had 6 children, all boys. They lived in a progressive community in Djursholm, where Nathaniel served as minister in the prosperous bourgeois suburb. Beskow pursued her illustration career, even though, despite her husband's sharing her progressive ideas, she had no dedicated workspace and was expected to run the home and care for the children. The first book she wrote and illustrated, The Story of the Little Old Woman, and I'm just going to use the English translations for all of the books, was published in 1897. By the time Beskow died in 1953, she was one of Sweden's most beloved children's book creators. Her work featured in many school books, and she came to shape a particular vision of Swedish childhood. If you just look at the titles I've posted here, you can see the degree to which nature is a key element in children's lives as she envisions them. Beskow's art was influenced by the Art Nouveau, or as it was called, National Romanticism in Sweden, that was so popular at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. In the Swedish Institute for Children's Books, I found old school workbooks illustrated by the artist John Bauer. These presented drawing lessons for children. They're actually quite charming because some of them are used. The Swedish Institute for Children's Books collects books by donation. So you have these workbooks that actually have children's work in them. What the books focus on in terms of drawing is taking natural images and then stylizing them for design purposes. Beskow has herself been critiqued for presenting nature in too stylized a fashion. But there's a very long tradition in Swedish criticism dating from the 1950s that identifies her work as botanically accurate and deeply significant to a national appreciation for nature. You can see her attention here in this slide from Tomtebarnen, Children of the Forest from 1910. And I will just make a note. My slides come from a lot of different sources, so you'll see a little bit of variation in quality. Some are from PDFs I made in Sweden. Some are things I've got from sources, other sources, and some I've had to take photographs of myself. So the lighting may vary on some of these. So here, despite the scenario, there's a fanciful kind of battle against a snake going on, you can see the realistic lichen on the tree trunk. Nature is never background in her work. It's an element in all of her work, even when it's not the subject of her narrative. In that first picture book again, the story of the little old woman, all the pages are decorated with plant motifs, and on this page here you can see pussy willows, and you can also get a foretaste of her anthropomorphism in the disapproving plants who are watching the cat get into the milk. A trend popularized by English artist Walter Crane's Flora's Feast from 1889 was the parade of flowers. Beskow was familiar with the illustration styles of Crane and other English illustrators like Randolph Caldecott. She also would have known Swedish illustrator Ottilia Adelberg's 1892 alphabet book, which also features a parade of flower people. It was a book prepared, an alphabet book for the three Swedish princes. Some of the early work that Beskow did as an illustrator for other authors was also in this vein. For instance, her work for Gina Otterdal's book, Blommårnes book, or the Flowers book. And in all of these books, you have the plant people that Beskow is drawing, somewhat stylized, but still very recognizable as particular plants. But all of these other books do not have a narrative function, and I think that is actually quite key in Beskow's transformative approach to thinking about children and plants. So the best known book by Beskow is called The Flowers Festival. You can see the influence of Crane and Otterdal here in a parade of fairies. Well, they're not fairies, there's no wings, a parade of flower people in the cover of the English edition. But they do look like they're just kind of little humanoids dressed up in clothing made out of plant material. But if you look more closely, the barley boys have their barley spikes growing right from their head. And Mrs. Clover has a floral headdress that also is growing from her head. That is her hair. They are not just miniature humanoids in plant costumes. They are plant people. A major, and as I've said, a major distinction in her work is that she is not simply presenting a spectacle. Her book has a story, and her plant people live within a complex community. The book opens with a small girl, Lisa, sad because she cannot attend the Midsummer's Eve festivities. Instead, her grandmother tells her she'll, quote, have to spend her midsummer with the flowers, end quote. Midsummer's Eve is a liminal time, the solstice, a time when the veil between the human and other worlds is thinner. Lisa thinks that the flowers look different than usual and are trying to speak to her. Beskow has said that the story came to her when she was in a blooming meadow and felt the flowers, quote, called to her. Lisa encounters the avatar of midsummer. The English translation calls her a fairy, but this concept is not used in the Swedish edition. She interprets the flowers for Lisa, stating that the flowers want Lisa to join their midsummer festival. She then puts poppy juice in Lisa's eyes so that she becomes invisible and can witness the festival. The reason given for her needing to be invisible is a bit odd, so that Lisa will not frighten the flowers with her greater size. Surely, though, if the flowers desire Lisa's attendance, they are not frightened by her. I think this particular piece of business is more in line with folkloric tales of humans granted the ability to see supernatural worlds by ointments in their eyes. The next observation is interesting. Although Lisa has seen the flowers in the meadow before now, we are told with her enhanced sight that the meadow was full of life. If Lisa has perhaps been somewhat plant blind previously, seeing flowers only as part of a pretty scene, she now has the sight to recognize that the plants are living beings with a complex social structure. They are readying for the Midsummer Festival. It is noteworthy that the plants are all ages and have familial structures. At the start of the festival, the social organization becomes evident. The flowers parade to the celebration by biome, the meadow plants followed by forest plants, and finally the plants from the lake and marsh. This is a hierarchical society with Queen Rose presiding. She asks after her cousin Queen Water Lily. So presumably each habitat has its ruling court. There is no distinction based on wild versus domestic plants. Even the house plants attend the feast. Entertainment at the feast is provided by a bumblebee, several birds, and a frog, demonstrating interspecies interactions. Their stories provide more insight into the familial and social structures of the plant's world. The goldfish tells of Mrs. Chestnut in bloom at midsummer and speaks of her many sons. Mrs. Chestnut's gown is definitely in the style of rational dress, popular with progressives at this time, eschewing corsets and constriction. But some have speculated that Mrs. Chestnut is actually pregnant, which would also be rather daring at this time, even in Sweden, as it was uncommon for female pregnancy to be depicted. The birth-death cycles of generations are also addressed in the Chaffinch's story about Mrs. Broadbean, depicted rocking her babies in a pod. She tells her babies that they will grow to go out in the world to have their own babies to rock, who will in turn themselves grow to have babies. The illustration, interestingly, does not anthropomorphize the baby beings, although they do look a little bit like embryos. Of course, scientists in the 19th century began to study mammalian embryos through dissection. Images of living human embryos were not possible until the 1950s. But it's kind of an interesting connection to think about. The study of plant genetics has determined that just as humans do, plants transmit genetic traits to offspring. Moreover, although the presentation of plant families echoes human classifications of plants, those classifications are still based on characteristics inherent to and shared by plants. Beskow would not have had the same understanding of plants that scientists do today, but her representation of plant communities nonetheless asks readers to think about plants as living, connected, agential beings. One of the most intriguing aspects of Beskow's plant world in this book is its class divisions and her undermining of these. The garden warbler tells of arrogant Madame Pansy. The accompanying illustration heightens the separation between Madame and her deferential poorer relations, the violets and violas. But the story tells of Madame's comeuppance when she trips on her fancy gown and falls flat on her face. Her relatives hide their laughter and offer to help her hold up her gown. We are told that Madame Pansy has been much nicer to her small half-brothers and sisters. Class hierarchy is also destabilized by the seemingly random bestowal of titles. In a story about the bird's foot trefoil, who is weeping at the ugliness of her common name, Vetch, she is given the more pleasing sounding name Senna and cheered as Princess Senna. This is the image on the current Swedish edition of the book. There's all the plants carrying Princess Senna on their shoulders. Similarly, the shy wintergreen is named Pirola with no title, but in a song for her by some twin flowers, she is called Princess Pirola. Sometimes titles clearly reflect status, as with Queen Rose or Madame Pansy, but other times they seem to have nothing to do with status. Another key undermining of class divisions in the book occurs with the weeds. Before the festivities begin, they try to join in and are repulsed by the other plants. Queen Rose, however, allows them to remain, calling on one of the weeds, the knightly-looking thistle, to police their behavior. When the sparrow contributes his entertainment, he cheekily presents the song of the weeds. There's definitely some pleasure in looking at their carnivalesque disruption. In the illustration, they glow with ruddy health, and a little sticky weed cocks a snook, tying out, while a tall wintercress stinks out his tongue. They boldly stare at the reader, two with arms crossed, though perhaps for different reasons, since one is a thistle, and two with arms akimbo. The sparrow describes the weeds as always full of fun and proclaims that they will never be eradicated. This is borne out, as despite a small burdock boy getting in trouble for flinging burrs at the flowers, the queen rejects violence against the weeds. The flowers, vegetables, and fruits will indeed never be rid of them. Not all plants must be useful to humans to deserve existence. The flowers' feast starts to end when the plants and Lisa begin falling asleep. Beskow resists the "it was all just a dream" conclusion, letting the frog have the last word, singing his song. This is a subtle reminder that the more than human world exists, whether we humans are present in it or not. In this book, the child character is a witness rather than engaging with the plants directly. Such witnessing has value, though, as it shares with readers the notion of seeing the natural world differently. Foregrounding the lives of plants. It represents plants as akin and perhaps kin to us, living within relationships and in communities, communicating with one another, and in the case of the weeds, insisting on inclusion and agency. Beskow's treatment of plant hierarchies is often read as a commentary on human class hierarchies, and a strong argument can definitely be made for that. However, this might also translate to a commentary on human plant hierarchies. If superior plants are humbled or made to accept their coexistence with weeds, does this not also suggest that we humans must accept our coexistence with plants and learn to live more mindfully with them? I would like to turn now to consider Beskow's treatment of more direct child-plant interactions. The encounter between a child and plant people first occurs in what many call her breakout book, Peter in Blueberry Land, published in 1901. Here, the interaction seems essentially transactional. Peter goes into the forest to pick blueberries and cranberries to surprise his mother for her birthday. When, after going further and further into the forest, he struggles to find any berries and sits weeping on a stump, he is rescued by the Blueberry King. The Blueberry King looks more gnome-like than plant-like, though his sons, the Blueberry Boys, you can see them in the cart with Peter and his red hat on the cover of the book. The Blueberry Boys look more like Beskow's later drawings of plant people. The boys fill Peter's pail with blueberries, and after some playtime, take him to see Mrs. Cranberry. Her daughters also do all the work of picking Peter's cranberries. Again, Peter plays with the plant children and then enjoys some cranberry stewed in honey before going home. Once home, he thinks it has been a dream until he sees the 2 baskets of berries that he did not pick. The berry people all seem quite happy to help Peter, but there is no sense that Peter would be engaging with them if he didn't want their berries. And I should just note, I'm actually wondering about the translation of cranberries here because, unless there's some bog around, you normally don't get cranberries in the forest, but I'll leave that for a later investigation. Thinking about the relationship with plants in this book, Stina Hammer, who is probably the predominant scholar on Elsa Beskow, she was invited by the Beskow family to write the first biography of Beskow, and in 2002 published a magisterial and massive tome, which is won't say the last word, but which is a highly respected and authoritative book on Beskow. So in this book, Hammer cites Gurley Linder's observation that the book is a cure for melancholy. In Peter's case, his melancholy is cured by playing in the forest among the flora and fauna. Hammer also points out that Peter, sitting on the stump in despair in the beginning, has his eyes closed with one fist almost covering one eye, whereas at the end, he sits on the stump with his eyes wide open. He has learned to see the richness of the natural world. In this reading, Peter, like Lisa, has had a transformational encounter with plants. In a later book, 1920s Christopher's Garden, Beskow explores more varied child-plant interactions. The English edition has also been sold under the title Christopher's Harvest Time, but that's more an identification of the season than a description of what happens in the book. Unlike Peter in his adventures in Blueberry Land, here Christopher does not begin his adventures in nature from a transactional perspective. Even though he is in a domestic garden that produces fruits and vegetables, he is not there to harvest but to play. He loses his ball in a tree, and it is caught by the avatar of September, who throws the ball into the garden for Christopher to chase. The movement of the story follows Christopher seeking his ball. The only beings that raise the subject of harvesting produce are the plant people. The gooseberry boys first refuse to give Christopher his ball because he's been too greedy and is eating of gooseberries in the summer. A red currant girl tells Christopher that the currants are becoming overripe and that he should tell his mother they need to be picked. Mrs. Bramley gives Christopher an apple from her tree, but he refuses the invitation to try plums from the plum trees, as he's been told by his mother not to eat them yet. Finally, Mr. Pear does not offer fruit, but tells Christopher that some of his branches are getting heavy and need to be propped by Christopher's father. Clearly, there's a more complex set of interactions here between the plants and the humans than simply humans taking what they want from the garden. There is a reciprocal element of care at work, and Christopher also learns that there is a proper time to eat foods as well as consequences for taking more than one needs. Hammer notes that for all its similarities to the Flowers Festival, Christopher's Garden is a much more democratic text, as hierarchy is abolished. Of course, there is still a lingering human capacity for snobbery in the strawberry family, who are clearly quite pleased with themselves and pleased to receive the respect paid by the wild strawberries. This illustration goes with a song sung by September, as Mrs. Bramley says the strawberries are asleep and must not be disturbed. These are the only plants with whom Christopher has no direct interaction. In keeping with the theme of seeing, it is notable that Mrs. Strawberry and her eldest daughter have their eyes closed, signifying lack of engagement with others. Perhaps there is some hope offered by the baby strawberry, who gazes out at us as he rides his snail. Hammer is particularly struck by this book's debate about the most useful plant in the garden. Christopher thinks it is Mrs. Bramley because, as he says, no one else has such lovely flowers in spring and such delicious fruit in the autumn. He is immediately taken to task however, by Mrs. Cabbage, who harumphs that she's no good for a proper meal. Hammer finds this exchange admirable in terms of Beskow championing cheap and nutritious food, which she partly ties to a post-war economy, post-World War I economy, that is. But I have my doubts about the book giving the victory to Mrs. Cabbage. There's a caterpillar nibbling at the corner of her page, which bodes ill for the cabbages. Moreover, Mrs. Cabbage hardly has the last word, as the book continues to be focalized through Christopher and he moves on to encounter other plants. Nonetheless, this garden is generally a less hierarchical space than the meadow in the Flowers Festival, or even the forest in Peter and Blueberry Land. There's no Rose Queen or Blueberry King, and whether Mrs. Bramley or Mrs. Cabbage is more important is left as a somewhat moot point. Both have value. Indeed, the only crown in the book is worn by September. You can see that throughout the book, but notably in the final full-page illustration for the book. Mrs. Cabbage, in a snit, has thrown Christopher's ball into a flower patch, and the flowers have asked September and Christopher to pay a forfeit for the ball's return. So the finale of the book is September's song. Not only is he wearing a crown, but he has a halo behind his head formed by the corolla of one of the flowers, Mrs. Dahlia, I believe. To enhance his importance even further, he's directly beneath the sun. Since all plants live according to seasonal climatic cycles, September, as the harbinger of autumn, is indeed significant. However, he does not take himself too seriously, and the tension on him serves to highlight the egalitarian community throughout the garden. The bean and pea women are on one side of Mr. Pear, with the marigolds on his other side. The flowers flank September, and Mrs. Cabbage peers over the heads of the nasturtiums and the berries. Red and black currant sprays of berries decorate the two top corners of the image. There is no sense that utilitarian value trumps aesthetic value and vice versa. No sense that what is most necessary for human life is most important. We could debate that notion of necessary, of course. I'm a big believer in the importance of aesthetics. From behind Christopher, we share his view of a happy, diverse group of plants. Only Mrs. Cabbage has a frown. Clearly, she holds a bit of a grudge. The final page in the book is mostly print text. When September returns Christopher's ball and leaves, saying they should play again some other time, Christopher weeps. This is not like Peter's weeping in Peter and Blueberry Land. Peter weeps because he cannot see what he wants, the berries for his mother. Christopher, in contrast, weeps for the loss of connection, not only with September, but with the plant people as well. As he weeps, a voice says, "Don't be sad, Christopher. We're all still here, even though you can't always see us." This is Mrs. Bramley, who then promises, in response to Christopher's question, that the plant people will answer whenever he talks to them. In the end, Peter runs indoors to tell his parents everything he's learned about the garden. Whereas both Lisa and Peter have learned how to see plants, to recognize them as living beings within interconnected communities, Christopher learns how to interact with plants, that the relationships between plants extend to humans as well. Nature motifs and the value of children spending time in nature are strong elements in Beskow's plant-focused stories. However, these books do more than teach children to name plants or promote play in nature for well-being. By focusing on a theme of seeing across species boundaries and stressing cooperative interspecies interactions, Beskow combats plant blindness, establishes plants as beings whose existence is equally worthwhile as that of humans, and demonstrates the emotional rewards of connecting with the plant world. Her anthropomorphizing of plants does not reflect an anthropocentric perspective. The anthropomorphism serves to make the otherness of plants more comprehensible to children, as well as to generate interest in and empathy with plants. It also provides the conditions necessary to imagine making kin with plants. When Elsa Beskow first published her books, the children's play in nature she depicts was more common than it is today. In 2008, as an example, the Oxford Junior Dictionary removed a number of nature words, including plant names, to make room for more words related to technology. Children's dictionary, it can't just keep getting added to and added to. They need to maintain a kind of friendly size. But the politics of what goes in and out is very interesting. The nature writer Robert McFarlane and painter Jackie Morris have created a beautiful book about these words, the lost words, but it does not reverse the trend that many children will not in person see some of the plants named. I mean, I am not so naive to suggest that these books are going to transform human existence in the Anthropocene. There is no take a picture book and save the world tomorrow. Indeed, some critics have commented on the unfairness of expecting children to save us all from the dire ecological state of our world, with the corollary that children's literature must teach children to correct and prevent further ecological harm. While there is certainly some value in promoting actions that improve environmental health, it is potentially more effective to transform ways of seeing and thinking about the natural world. Thinking differently may not only lead to acting differently, but ultimately to having a different understanding of value and different expectations of economic systems. The United Nations declared 2020 the year of plant health. We are approaching the end of the year, and yet this initiative has yet to receive broad media attention. Did any of you know that? Action will only be effective in the long term if it is underpinned by a deep shift in how humans see their relationship to and with plants. Elsa Beskow's representation of human-plant interactions can contribute to such a shift by showing child readers new ways to look at plants and to think about how humans live with plants. So I do have for you a few slides of sources for my talk. I know that not everybody's into those, but this will be recorded and people can look at it later. So I'll just show you. I have primary sources. So these are all of the picture books that I talk about. And for those who are interested, I have some slides of my secondary sources as well. I'm not going to linger over these because I'm not going to be examining on you or not you on your knowledge of them. So I will leave you by inviting anyone with questions or comments that don't get addressed today to email me at terri.doughty@viu.ca. I'm always happy to talk about my work and welcome any thoughts you have. Thank you.